they actually did fix it. The fix is now in, and now it's understating inflation.
I see. Yeah.
But the problem is now inflation is so high that they can't pretend it's under 2%. But the point I was making is the Fed had a policy goal. We want more inflation. Yeah. Well, they delivered. We got more inflation, a lot more inflation.
Peter, everybody wants to know your take. You've regularly said, and you've warned about this, that once the inflation genie is out of the bottle, it's not going back in. Where are we now that it seems like inflation has somewhat peaked and at least we're trending down? Even though it may take longer, it seems like we're not going to the 70s again. What say you?
No, I think we're just starting a decade that is actually going to be worse than the 70s from the standpoint of how bad inflation is. And in fact, last year, if you measured prices the way they measured them in the 1970s, the inflation that we experienced in prices in 2022 was actually worse than any year of the 1970s. In fact, it was worse than 1980 or 81. So we're already off to a really bad start. But you have to understand that the inflation of the 1970s, those seeds were planted mainly in the 1960s.
With the price caps?
Not the price caps. That was kind of the first attempt to kind of attack the symptoms of inflation. Because remember, inflation is a very misunderstood word. And people think it means rising prices. It doesn't, right? If you get an old dictionary, an old Webster's dictionary, it doesn't even have to be that old, in the 1970s, even 1980s. And you look up the word inflation and it says to expand, expansion of the money supply, expansion of the supply of money and credit. A result of inflation is that prices go up. But the government and certain maybe Keynesian politicians that support government, they wanted to fool the public so that they really wouldn't understand where inflation came from. So they kind of redefined it as rising prices. Because the government doesn't raise prices, right? Private businesses raise prices. Like you look at Elizabeth Warren today when she was questioning Powell. She was trying to imply that prices were rising because businesses were gouging their customers, right? Inflation is not caused by businesses, it's caused by government. Government expands the money supply. The Federal Reserve does that in response to deficit spending from Congress. And so it's government that is the source of all inflation. But by mislabeling it as rising prices, they can deflect the blame. But getting back to why we had the big increase in prices in the 1970s, in the 1960s, that's when we had the Lyndon Johnson real big increase in government spending, both on welfare and warfare. We had the actual war in Vietnam, right? We also had, the space race. So we're spending a lot of money on NASA, spending a lot more money on Vietnam. Then we get these great society programs and the beginning of Medicare, Medicaid, and all this. And they called it guns and butter at the time, right? We're spending. And then they started running these big deficits. And where'd the money come from to finance these deficits? Federal Reserve printed it. Now, because they printed so much money, back in the 60s, we were on a gold standard. And because they printed so much money, our creditors realized that we couldn't make good on our obligations to pay gold, because all dollars were IOUs for gold. So in 1971, because there was a gold drain, because our creditors were taking their Federal Reserve notes and asking for their gold, the official rate was, $35 got you an ounce of gold. But after a couple of devaluations, Nixon went off the gold standard. And then prices really just spiraled out of control because there was no restraint at all on the printing press through the 70s. So the money they printed in the 60s, they kept printing more in the 70s. And we didn't really step on the brakes until Volcker came around in the early 80s. But it started in the 60s. It showed up in the 70s. Now, the inflation that we experienced in 2021 and then worse in 2022, it really had its roots in the prior decade.
Wow.
It really started in earnest in 2009, following the 2008 financial crisis. That's when the Fed lowered rates to zero and launched quantitative easing for the first time.
Yeah, February of 09, yeah.
Right, and so basically from February of 09 until like March of last year, right?
Yeah.
Interest rates were basically at zero. Maybe it spent a year or two where we got up to 0.5%, 1%, 2%, but then quickly came back down. And, the balance sheet went from under $1 trillion to $9 trillion, wherever it went to.
After COVID, yeah, exactly.
Right, and we just flooded the economy with inflation, right? And in fact, the Fed wasn't, the Fed was honest about what it was doing in a way, because all the Fed chairmen said that we didn't have enough inflation, that we were below target, right? That the target was 2% and we were 1.5%. Oh my God, this is terrible. We don't have enough inflation. So it was a specific policy goal of the Fed to create inflation because they said we didn't have enough of it. Now, part of the reason was because they lied about it, because the CPI isn't honest. You generally have to double prices. So if the CPI says 1.5, it's 3.
I see.
But that means what? And it also, if it says 8, it's 16, right? So we've got massive inflation if you honestly measure the effect.
Is that because of the weightings that you were?
I don't even know how they calculate it anymore, but there's all kinds of substitution. The basket doesn't remain the same.
Of course. Yeah.
There is hedonics where they claim that quality is going up.
Right. Like the iPhone now might be $1,000, price went up, but the utility might be 100x.
Yeah, they claim, but I mean, but it's not any real better for the consumer. But there's so many other products where quality just goes down. I think about, air transportation. I mean, you don't have to worry about that anymore. Now you're flying around your private jet. But those of us who are still flying commercial, little people, you have to pay extra. You want a blanket, you want a pillow, you want to check your baggage, right? But they don't put this into the CPI. They just look at the price.
You're looking at ticket fare, but now they're charging you for everything they didn't previously charge.
And of course, you don't have, now you have 2 connections instead of nonstop. There's all kinds of delays. I mean, so the quality has gone down. As somebody who's flown, I can, attest to the fact that the quality is much lower than it was. But, they don't adjust for that.
Now, do you think that is because of COVID and the pilot and plane shortages, or just an example of CPI?
It's just an example of the CPI not capturing the degradation in quality. I mean, and a lot of companies cut back on, food companies. They'll give you lower quality ingredients in the food, less fresh stuff, more processed, and it goes, now pet food too, they put, crappier ingredients there. So there's all kinds of ways that they reduce the quality instead of increasing the price. Or maybe they do a combination of both, but the CPI doesn't get that. I mean, I know I did an exercise back in 2013. You could see the YouTube video up there. And this is in 2013. And I looked at the prices of newspapers and magazines because there's a part of the CPI that says newspapers and magazines.
Subscriptions, yeah.
Right. And according to the CPI, newspaper magazine prices over the prior 10-year period were up by 30%. And I looked at the prices on the exact same magazines on the covers in 2013, and I compared. And the actual increase was 130%, not 30%. So the question is, where did that other increase go?
Marketing.
It went into the CPI, but it didn't come out, right?
Yeah,
so I don't know the methodology, but I do know that the Boston Commission back in the, I think, late 80s, they convinced everybody, or the government convinced everybody, that the CPI was overstating inflation. So we needed to fix it so that it got it right. Well, they actually did fix it. The fix is now in, and now it's understating inflation.
I see. Yeah.
But the problem is now inflation is so high that they can't pretend it's under 2%. But the point I was making is the Fed had a policy goal. We want more inflation. Yeah. Well, they delivered. We got more inflation, a lot more inflation.
So they were right.
But we didn't.
Is Peter Schiff saying the Fed was right?
No, we didn't need more inflation. No. We needed it like a hole in the head. I mean, we needed less inflation. But they were hiding behind a rigged CPI to claim that we needed 2%. And, where is this 2%? Powell says that, we need price stability. Right. And that's defined as prices going up every year by 2%. Right. Now, how is that stable? That sounds like escalating prices.
I suppose the rate of change is stable, but yeah.
But prices themselves aren't stable. Right. Stable prices they're the same.
True.
That's stability, right? But they just concocted the idea that it was 2%. But the whole 2% number came out of New Zealand. That's where it started. But it started as a ceiling. It was not a target like we need 2% inflation. Like if you only have 1, that's a problem. You need to, it was, as long as you were below 2, you didn't have to worry. The minute it got to 2, you had to do something about it.
So it's almost like your cholesterol should be under this level, but if you're below it, you shouldn't be trying to raise it.
Exactly.
Okay.
But they said we needed to target 2%, which I always thought was such a ridiculous, or the amount of hubris that you would have to have as a central banker to think that if inflation is 1.8, you could just dial it up a little bit and hit 2%, like right on the money. Or if it was 2.1, you just dial it right back down. I mean, if your inflation is 1.5, that's close enough to 2. Why would you even, like, it was even worse with the ECB, because the ECB, if you remember these Mario Draghi comments, they said that their goal wasn't 2%. Their goal was to be close to, but below 2%. So they were targeting like 1.99.
Right.
And they were saying, 1 year, I was talking about my podcast, I think it was 2018 or 19, inflation in the Eurozone was like 1.74.
Sure.
Yet they still had interest rates at negative 40 basis points. They were doing QE because they weren't close enough to being just under 2%.
Right.
And they were 25 basis points away. Now they're at 9%.
Yeah.
Now they're so far above.
Right.
But are they panicking? No. I mean, they still got interest rates at 2.5. They're not even shrinking their balance sheet. And, they're 700 basis points above their target. Yet they were freaking out when they were 25 basis points below. But the whole idea that you need inflation is absurd.
What if we had deflation?
Great. I mean, now, you're looking at falling prices, but if you go and look at the CPI in 1900 and look at the CPI in 1800, prices were cut in half over 100 years. So we had falling prices for 100 years.
Through innovation.
Yes, that's what's good. And everything. I mean, look, you got a cell phone here. You remember how much the first cell phone cost?
The first phone I got was like a T-Mobile Razor or something like that.
Well, you're still young. But like I remember, I don't know if you ever saw Wall Street.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
He's got this.
Gordon Gekko, right?
That thing back then in the mid 80s, that was like a $2,000 or $3,000 phone.
Oh my gosh.
You could have I bought my first car in 1980. It was an MGB. I paid $3,700. So a cell phone was about a car. Right? How many people had them, right? Wow. Why does everybody have cell phones now?
If prices come down.
Yes, that's a good thing. Because they try to tell us that, well, if prices come down, no one's going to buy anything. No, that's how you get more people to buy.
Sure, the standard of living goes up, more people have TVs, more people have cars. Like comparing today to the 50s, the standard of living, would you argue has gone up?
No, I'd argue it's gone down. But the price of TVs have gone down.
That's true, okay.
People have a lot more TVs today. Right. So if you grow up in a house, you got a TV in every room, but your mom's not there because she's working 2 jobs, and you never, because back in the 1950s, if you had a guy went to high school, he could support his wife, 4 kids, buy a car, save for retirement, no credit cards. I mean, people had, I think, a higher quality of life before government got so big. But the free market, the whole time the government has been undermining our standard of living, the free market has been doing what it can to improve it. And so the technology has gotten better. And so, we have more computers, we have more cameras. Of course, they're all made in Japan or China now. We used to make all the cameras ourselves, when we still had an industry before the government destroyed that. But the idea that we need prices to go up is just completely absurd. When prices go down, people's standard of living goes up. Everybody wants to buy more stuff. And the way you buy more stuff is the price of the stuff goes down. Would anybody, like if you said to somebody, what do you want? Do you want food prices to go up or down? Do you want your rent to go up or down?
Sure.
Right? Do you want healthcare to be more expensive or less expensive? Right? Everybody wants prices to go down. Right. And then they'll try to say, well, but if you're a businessman, you want higher prices.
Sure.
No, you don't. You want higher margins.
Right.
You want lower prices and lower costs, because every businessman knows I can sell more if I can lower my price. Every businessman is trying to lower their price so they can have greater volume. So the key for a business is the difference between what it costs me to produce something and what I can sell it for. So businesses weren't hurt by falling prices. Think about all the money that these cell phone companies are making selling cell phones now at lower price points than when they were so expensive. You had to be, Gordon Gekko to afford to buy one. Right.